Hello, I'm Jonasz Rawiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Russia tightens its noose around Pokrovsk in a brutal siege that could reshape the front line in Ukraine. Last year, the Russians were a distant threat to the city, stalled some 30 kilometers away. Life felt tense but survivable. Today, the city finds itself under severe threat, as Russian troops have methodically crept within striking distance, attempting to seal it off entirely. Moscow's troops are inching closer, exploiting weaknesses and attempting a familiar playbook of encirclement. Is Pokrovsk doomed to become another Mariupol? Or is this where Russia's luck finally runs dry? Let's dive into the battle for Ukraine's strategic fortress in our latest report.
According to Ukrainian authorities, close to 1,400 civilians remain in the besieged town of Pokrovsk. What's worse, 2,700 more remain in the surrounding area. It is extremely difficult for humanitarian aid to reach the town. Necessities such as drinking water have become scarce. With each day, the Russians have been intensifying their attacks against the town, a key location within the eastern Ukrainian front line.
We've gotten used to it, but we're still afraid. Where would we even go? Our pensions are small.
Despite brave words, however, just earlier this week, almost 500 people were evacuated from the area in a single day. Some aid does reach the inhabitants who have remained here since the start of the war. The Ukrainian military is their main lifeline. The Russians seem to have the prize that is Pokrovsk in their sights. This footage allegedly shows the chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Russia, Valery Gerasimov, personally inspecting the soldiers in the region, a PR move that the Russians usually don't make unless they believe that the situation is under their control. But whatever the Russians may think about the situation, Ukrainian soldiers will continue to defend the area for as long as it is possible. Even should the town fall, they will make the Russians pay very, very dearly for all the suffering and death that they have wrought on innocent land and people.
And now let's zone in on the east-splaining portion of our show. Every inch of land matters in the war of Russia's making against Ukraine. Control over small towns may lead to insurmountable strategic advantages. Pokrovsk is one of such settlements.
Pokrovsk is an unassuming town located in the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. Over the last several months, Russian forces have been heavily pushing for it, as it is a crucial strategic point on the front line. The most important role that Pokrovsk plays is that of a vital regional transport and logistics hub. It sits on a vital road and railway junction in its region and serves as an excellent connection to central Ukraine. It is one of the major points through which the Ukrainian army can resupply itself. If Ukrainian forces should lose the city, then the Russians could be in a position where they could threaten much deeper Ukrainian supply lines, which in turn would have disastrous consequences for several different parts of the front. Control over Pokrovsk would also give Russian forces the opportunity to surround other pockets of the Ukrainian army and cities that are nearby and require the town to maintain the positions. Kostiantynivka is another vital town that would be immediately threatened if the Russians captured Pokrovsk.
And now, as always, we're closing the distance and looking at the issue in greater detail. This once relatively secure hub has now become the latest flashpoint in the brutal trench and drone warfare engulfing eastern Ukraine. The road from safety to siege didn't happen overnight, though. Following the devastating fall of Avdiivka on the 17th of February 2024, Russian forces surged forward with unexpected persistence, despite staggering losses, over 16,000 soldiers and 300 vehicles. Yet unfortunately, the battered Russian forces regrouped, pushing forward in fits and starts, leveraging moments when Ukrainian defenses faltered due to problematic troop rotations and the exhausting realities of sustained warfare. This irregular but persistent pressure has allowed Russia to edge ever closer to Pokrovsk, now just 10 kilometers away from the city's outskirts. Now, on paper, 10 kilometers might seem insignificant. In the Donbas, however, where progress is measured in blood-soaked meters rather than kilometers, this is alarmingly rapid. Each meter gained by Russia represents enormous losses for Ukraine in both human lives and morale. Pokrovsk is now essentially encircled, its defensive lines resembling a horseshoe, as Russian artillery menaces the critical M30 road, Ukraine's lifeline. Russian forces are already within range of this vital artery. systematically controlling minor roads to the city's south. It is a grim echo of past sieges, including Bakhmut and Avdiivka, where encirclement tactics pressured Ukrainian commanders, including President Zelensky and General Syrsky, and previously General Zaluzhny, into difficult decisions to withdraw and regroup rather than risk complete annihilation. Yet, despite these tactical Russian victories, strategic success remains elusive. Russia has consistently failed to achieve a decisive encirclement, allowing Ukraine's army to retreat strategically, establish new lines, and continue fighting. Pokrovsk could follow this tragic pattern, a devastating tactical loss for Ukraine, but still far from a strategic victory for Russia. The ongoing battle has become a total war of attrition for both sides, deliberately designed to bleed each other dry. Ukraine, defending its land, faces enormous strain, with dwindling reserves and mounting casualties. On the other hand, Russia's gains are minimal, their costs astronomically high, and their rewards questionable. Conquered territories resemble ghost towns, stripped of resources, infrastructure, shattered beyond practical repair, and populated largely by elderly Ukrainians resigned to their fate. The essential question isn't whether Ukraine can endure the loss of Pokrovsk, but rather how much longer can they sustain this brutal attrition. Every city lost weakens Ukraine's position, draining precious manpower and morale. Ultimately, Pokrovsk symbolizes the tragic paradox of this war: massive effort and staggering losses, all for terrain whose value diminishes daily. The battle may be decisive tactically, but strategically, it might change nothing. For Ukraine, holding Pokrovsk means buying precious time. For Russia, it's another costly push towards elusive victory. And now here to shed more light on the issue is retired Colonel Ray Wojcik, former military attaché at the US Embassy in Warsaw. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Good to be here again.
So let's begin with the situation in Pokrovsk. Why do you think the Russians were able to make these slow gains? Even though obviously they have actually incurred tremendous casualties, it still seems to be bringing them some results there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are making some limited gains, but you have to look back. In the last year and a half, the Russians have made fewer gains on the ground broadly across the front than we saw in World War I. The Allies were making greater advances in the trench warfare against the Germans, which we all remember as some sort of stalemate, frozen conflict. So the Russians have made some gains, it's true. The Ukrainians are dealing with some challenges in Pokrovsk right now, but they've held on bravely for 6 months. April and May, they pushed the Russians back significantly. So whether or not Pokrovsk falls or not, the Ukrainians have put significant casualties against the Russians in this battle.
Would you say it's a change of tactics? The Russians would actually send in those large groups of vehicles. Now these armored vehicles are often just eliminated immediately by drones. Would you say that perhaps the new way in which they're doing this, with smaller groups and also using some more advanced methods connected to drone warfare, that this might have been something that Ukraine is still trying to deal with?
Yeah, there's no question that the Russians can learn. From the beginning of the war, we saw the disaster of the Russian army trying to invade Ukraine on multiple fronts. No access was able to push through. And then what we've seen in 3 years is basically the Ukrainians holding the line. And in some cases, the Russians have made some gains, and they're learning. So they're using these new tactics as a way to put the Ukrainians on their back foot. And the Ukrainians also, from their part, they have a manning issue. The Ukrainians established a conscription age of, reduced it from 27 to 25 a year and a half ago. And that's not good enough. They need more soldiers, and they need the capability to train them. And that's where Europe and the United States play a role, too.
What if Pokrovsk actually falls? What impact will it have on the situation on the front line?
Yeah, my assessment is it's important. It is a logistics hub as described, but this is not catastrophic. Look, it took the Russians a year and a half to take Avdiivka. They lost thousands, tens of thousands in casualties in that battle, and they've lost tens of thousands already in Pokrovsk. It is an important logistics hub for the Donbas. It's not going to be a crisis situation for the army. It's symbolic for the Russians to say they'll make a big deal that they took this critical node. But in the longer term of the frontline battle, it's not the end of the world for Ukraine, and they're digging and preparing fallback positions as we speak, and the Russians will continue to lose tens of thousands. That's again why I return to Ukraine needs to fix its manning issue.
So we're looking at a war of attrition, essentially. What are the respective breaking points, would you say, especially when it comes to Russia? Because obviously we keep looking at the question of manpower, and Russia, undisputably, has more manpower available. The question is, how much of that can actually be tapped into before producing problems for the Kremlin itself?
Well, it's shocking to me, but maybe not so shocking, because we see what the Russians were able to sustain through the centuries, particularly in World War II. Millions are killed, and the Russian totalitarian state, keeps the message to patriotism, doing your duty for the country, and that's what they're attempting to do here. But it's a new 21st century world with internet access. It can't be forever that the Russians could sustain these kinds of casualties, and the mothers, like the mothers in Georgia, or Chechnya, excuse me, we repeat that. And then there's when the Russians have to especially go after Russian soldiers and conscripts and get them out of St. Petersburg and Moscow, which they've been trying to avoid since the beginning of the war. That's when the message will become more loud to the Kremlin about how the people feel about this war.
What about supply chains? Russia has recently been showing off its drone manufacturing plant in Alabuga, and some commentators were saying, well, the reason why they're being so open about it is that they know, for the time being, this is out of bounds. Ukraine doesn't have the means to attack it and inflict serious damage. Do you think this could change in the near future?
Yes, and I think the Ukrainians have shown, again, from the beginning of the war, their ability to innovate long-range systems. So that strike a month and a half ago on the various airfields, taking out strategic nuclear capability against the Russians.
Operation Spiderweb.
Spiderweb shocked the world. So that kind of thing, and the Ukrainians have been working on long-range UAVs and long-range missiles on top of that. So they don't totally rely on everything from the West at this point. What the West provides, especially the United States, is still very, very important. Artillery, rocket artillery, and then, of course, the Patriot system is vital. But the Ukrainians have shown that they can do much on their own, and they're producing, the numbers I've heard are about 50% of what they need themselves. What needs to happen is more Western cooperation on the industrial front in Ukraine.
Isn't the problem, though, that facilities such as that, they are not like, aircraft standing out in the open, which could be easily damaged by smaller drones? Ukrainian drones can fly up to this factory because they did in the past. However, because they need to have extended range, they don't have sufficient payload to inflict damage. Do you think this can be addressed somehow? Some analysts have pointed towards Tomahawk missiles, but this still seems to be something that's way out there in the distance, right?
Yeah, Tomahawk,
if at all.
Yeah, Tomahawk missiles, that's a big controversial question mark for the United States to potentially transfer those or allow transfer from a third party like the UK. And then the other part of this, though, again, the Ukrainians have shown their innovativeness. They used old air defense systems to create long-range effects against the Black Sea Fleet. So what you're talking about, those distances are much greater, and they're working. We know they're working on this kind of long-range capability of either cruise missiles to fly over large parts of Russian territory. And the Russians have shown that they don't have the capability to defend the homeland. They have shown over and over their ineffectiveness in their own air defense. That's why showing Russia that nothing is protected, even that factory, is important for the strategic part of the battle, which is Ukraine wants to show Russia that they're here for the long term and they're not going away and they're not going to fold as Russia continues to increase its air assaults on them.
What if Western countries begin to fold? I mean, we've been seeing that over and over again, the question of how determined we are. Because from what you're saying, this is really about the kind of weapons that we can provide Ukraine with in order to make advances against the Russian forces, especially when it comes to facilities located deep inside Russia, which provide them with all the equipment used to attack Ukraine on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's where NATO still has to grow a backbone. I mean, just look at the Taurus example, the German air-to-ground capability that they have not transferred. They've talked about for months, years, of providing Taurus to Ukraine. This would give them another long-range air-to-ground capability to go after deeper targets. Getting the lift on the HIMARS year plus ago under the Biden administration, it was held back, preventing Ukraine from making the gains. So this kind of NATO backbone we've seen at the NATO summit. NATO is making progress, significant progress, at least on spending. But on these kinds of political decisions, it's not clear whether NATO is going to be able to, muster the political will to do it as NATO, maybe individual countries.
Now, speaking of NATO, what do you make of the latest statement by the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Alexis Grinkiewicz? The general basically said that, look, you might actually need to speed up your preparations. There is a risk of Russia and China colluding, perhaps some sort of provocation taking place in 2027. How does this relate to the war in Ukraine? What is your general opinion of this particular statement?
Well, number one, we should take that very seriously. And number two, we've seen since the beginning of the war, these declarations and actual substantial weapons support from China to Russia. We can't forget, too, the symbiotic relationship of Russia transferring energy supplies to China at a discount, which is both funding Russia's war machine and providing China the energy it needs to build its war machine. So this symbiotic relationship is very important to them. So it's no question that in a future conflict in the Pacific, there would be reciprocal support, Russia and China working together or even simultaneously. That's why it's so important for us to do everything. I'm talking about the United States, the West, and Europe specifically, to arm Ukraine. And then one last point I want to make here. Europe has said, the EU, that we're going to commit $800 billion to rearm ourselves. And there's still these discussions about, hey, we need to transfer and buy American weapons and transfer. How much is that? And if there's $800 billion out there that's already committed, there should be no question that Europe is ready to spend what it takes to get Ukraine in a position to defeat Russia.
And now, speaking of, once again, the situation that we're facing today, do you think that at this current pace, it is actually possible for Russia to pose a threat to Europe by the date mentioned, 27, for example? Because it does seem like it's not really aiming for any sort of peace or ceasefire in Ukraine, which would have allowed it to free up some of its forces. Quite the opposite, in fact, right?
Yeah, but Russia doesn't have to launch a full-on attack against NATO. Russia just needs to conduct an incursion, whether it's in Estonia, the Suwalki Gap between around the Lithuanian-Polish border, something like that, to interdict or to cross the border and see what NATO's reaction is going to be. That would be enough to distract NATO and, of course, America with an attack from China on Taiwan. So that's all very plausible for Russia to do some sort of limited attack, put a conundrum in front of NATO.
Provocation, for example.
Provocation.
How should we respond to that? If we have, for example, some suspicious protesters, or we have, again, mysterious individuals wearing military uniforms with no insignia, like we had in Crimea?
Well, hopefully we've learned the lesson from Crimea and these other provocations the Russians are doing. So far, I'm not totally impressed with how we're going after the shadow fleet, for example. So the Russians are getting away with high seas piracy, basically moving energy supplies through the Baltic Sea. It's a NATO-covered total water body, basically, except for Russia. And we're allowing NATO, Russia, to almost with impunity to use the shadow fleet to keep fueling its economy. So unless we get that under control, I'm not quite sure what you're describing. We'll have that figured out. But it's certainly something NATO needs to be planning for, this kind of provocation incursion.
Colonel Ray Wójcik was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Russia seems to really like using the word special when it comes to its policies. This time, the Russian government has created the so-called Demographic Special Forces Unit to combat its historically low birth rate.
Reportedly, any regional government agency in Russia will have a deputy minister responsible for demographics. The government says that what it calls family issues has become a top priority for it. The establishment of this new unit is in line with Russia's previous attempts at trying to address its demographic collapse. In the past, Russian authorities tried extensive social campaigns meant to encourage people to form larger families, as well as restricting abortion and leaning on public appeals from various officials, such as Vladimir Putin himself. Despite these efforts, Russia's demographics continue to decline. In typical Russian fashion, authorities have also restricted access to detailed demographic data, as well as the country's overall population numbers in a reported attempt to control the public's perception of the crisis.
Moscow continues to hold various military drills in its different theaters of operation. The Russian Pacific Fleet recently launched the so-called July Storm initiative.
The point of the July Storm drills is for Russia to test its ability to protect critical maritime infrastructure, according to the Russian Pacific Fleet Press Service. The drills are taking place in the Russian Far East regions of Primoria and Kamchatka. They also include joint operations with the FSB and various border patrol units. Some of the exercises involve responses to attacks by unmanned surface vessels and drones, which have become a cornerstone of modern warfare. The drills will also span more than just the Far East. They will also be held in the Arctic, Baltic and Caspian regions. According to Russian sources, the entire affair involves 150 warships and support vessels, as well as 120 aircraft and over 15,000 troops.
An Indian company has reportedly sent military explosives to Russia. This comes despite the United States warning about potential sanctions should such aid be delivered to Moscow.
According to a report by Reuters citing Indian customs data, an Indian company delivered more than $1.4 million worth of military explosives to Russia in December 2024. The explosive in question, Octagen, is reportedly commonly used in missile and torpedo warheads, rocket engines, and explosive shells, among other equipment. The US has labeled the substance as critical for Russian military efforts and has warned against supplying Moscow with it under threat of sanctions. India has so far officially maintained a neutral position on the war between Russia and Ukraine, while simultaneously growing its economic relationship with Russia. So far, India has resisted US pressure to distance itself from Moscow and has continued to purchase Russian crude oil.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.